Hello, you're listening to Storytelling Saga, the podcast that shares stories. I'm your host, Allie, and this week I am so excited to welcome Betsy Rosenblatt to the podcast. Welcome, Betsy.
Hi, good, happy to be here.
I want to start by asking you about your background and kind of where you went to school, your current job. I know you are a professor of law, and then what led you to, well, we'll get into it too, with being a legal chair of Organization for Transformative Work. So first off, like what you studied in school, to start with that.
Well, I went to college at a college called Williams College in Massachusetts, and there I studied music and Russian. So I was a composer and a
Wow.
performer of music. And I also studied Russian at the time. It was a time of great change in the Soviet Union and former Soviet Union. You can tell I'm old. Uh, um, and so I studied Russian language and literature, but the music stuff was part of what led me toward what I do now, which is that creating things and creative expression have always been really important to me. So then I went to law school. I went to Harvard Law School and had a wide variety of things I studied there, both in the sort of the same tracks. I studied international and trans-border law, and I studied intellectual property law. Intellectual property law includes copyrights, trademarks, and patents. Copyrights deal with works of authorship, trademarks deal with brands and brand names and logos, patents deal with inventions. And I really loved the intellectual property stuff. I think I thought that I wanted to do intellectual property law because I thought maybe doing music law would be like doing music. That was wrong. It's not. It's quite different in in almost every way, but it really exercises my brain in a way that makes me happy and keeps me interested. So I went then to a firm in Los Angeles called Irell and Manella, where I was able to do entertainment law and patent law. And that's a sort of a rare combination, that I could work both in the tech field. And at the time, internet tech was really coming into its own, and work in the entertainment field, dealing with copyrights and trademarks. So I did both of those things for almost a decade at Irell and Manella before becoming a professor of law.
That's really, really cool, kind of having all these, like not necessarily one set thing and like all these kind of different aspects of law. I think that's really fantastic.
If you ask about my professional history, some would say eclectic, others would say disjointed. I prefer eclectic.
Yes. Oh, that's great. I love that. So that's really awesome. So then, okay, so for the listeners now, so I met you personally through last December. I was at LA Comic Con, as I was just telling you. That was my first time going to a fan convention. It was so much fun. And then you were part of a panel about fan fiction. So tell me about like your part of that in terms of specifically with the Organization for Transformative Works.
Yeah, so I've been a Sherlockian all my life, and Sherlockian refers to a particular variety of devotee of Sherlock Holmes and the fiction and media surrounding Sherlock Holmes. And I've been a Sherlockian my whole life in a very literal sense. My parents are Sherlockians. There's a picture of me as an infant in a deerstalker cap. But I picked it up on my own as well, and have been sort of devoted to that particular corner of fan culture for most of my life. But Sherlockiana and what most people think of as fan culture are different communities in a lot of ways. They're overlapping communities, but they're not identical. I also encountered what we now think of as sort of media fandom, which is largely a female-driven pursuit of people who identify as female and write stories and make art and songs about TV and books and movies and other sort of media like that. It grew up in the internet era through Usenet, and then LiveJournal and Tumblr, and so it's this long-standing tradition of making based on things you love or things you want to criticize. You often want to criticize things you love.
That's very true, Yeah, so I've been writing fan fiction on and off pretty much since 2002. So I was a kid when I got into it. And I've always used this site, which is still going to this day, fanfiction.net.
Sure.
And so I know, of course, you're involved with Archive of Our Own. Do you know by any chance when that site was founded? Was that before fan fiction? I'm not even sure,
No,
actually.
so here's
Okay.
the history, actually,
Oh, yeah.
or a little bit of the history. There were people making and sharing fan fiction in various corners of the internet for a long time, including, say, Usenet. LiveJournal was a big place for that in the late 90s and early 2000s, late 90s, even mid to late 90s. But a couple of things happened at once. One was that it became obvious that there were certain things on LiveJournal that were vulnerable. LiveJournal was, could change its terms of service and take away your ability to post about certain things at will. And the same thing ended up being true of fanfiction.net. Fanfiction.net is a for-profit site that's advertising driven, and it made some decisions to ban certain kinds of content. And that set of decisions felt arbitrary, but it also felt commercially driven. And so much of fan works and fan fiction is about doing things that aren't commercially driven, doing things that are about community, about sharing with people you love. It's not about money, and it's not about doing the thing that's socially acceptable. And so a group of fans, including Naomi Novik and Francesca Coppa and Rebecca Tushnet and other people who I promise not leaving out intentionally, leaving out only accidentally, a group of wonderful fans decided that what fandom really needed was an archive where fans owned the servers that would be forever non-commercial, volunteer run, and not vulnerable to commercial interests, desires, and whims. And that was the founding of the Organization for Transformative Works and the Archive of Our Own. And that happened in 1998. So I became part of the Organization for Transformative Works not long after that, a couple years after that, I think about 2000, and took over from Rebecca Tushnet as legal chair a few years later, when she decided that she'd done an awful lot of work and wanted to continue doing that work, but as a regular member of the committee rather than as the head of it. So I'm very fortunate still to have her on the team doing a lot of wonderful work, but I've taken over as chair.
That's really cool. So what does that involve, say, like as a legal chair, are you working with other people like that work on the website? Are you working with people outside of it?
Yeah, it's a very diverse set of responsibilities. It's a volunteer position, which means I don't get paid. But in all other respects, it's a job.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's essentially being general counsel of a nonprofit, which means that all of the stuff about corporate law and nonprofit law and managing donations and that sort of thing is the legalities of that is the responsibility of our legal team. Also, things like setting legal policy for Archive of Our Own and the organization generally, addressing things like privacy and data protection law, because we run a website that deals with people's personal information, not a lot of personal information, but some, like, when you go to the site, your IP address is available to the site. And so we have to manage what we do with that under the law. And then the other piece of what the legal committee does, which is different from being general counsel, but is, I think, probably the most interesting part of the work, is we do legal advocacy on behalf of fans and fandom and fan creators. And in that capacity, we do education about the law. We do a lot of amicus briefing, that is filing briefs in lawsuits representing the position of somebody other than the parties, but explaining the law and the sort of relevant facts to a court that might not otherwise have them. We work with a lot of allies in the areas of copyright law, First Amendment law, rights of publicity law, trademark law, and internet law, telecom stuff. And we really address sort of all of those. We also do quite a bit of policy advising, policy participation. There are a lot of governments around the world, including the United States government, the Hong Kong government, the Australian government, the New Zealand government, the Canadian government, where they've wanted to think about their copyright law, either amending their copyright law or addressing technological changes through copyright law. And they ask for input from civil society organizations. And the Organization for Transformative Works is one such civil society organization. So we end up filing policy comments and recommendations with the US government and other governments around the world.
Wow, that's incredible. Honestly, though, the fact that it is volunteer, that's beautiful to me in a way, because you know what? That's how fan fiction is. Like, we don't get paid to write fan fiction. It's just purely for the love and passion for it. I think that's wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah. One of our sort of mottos is people write fan fiction because they can't help it.
Oh, I love that. That's so true. Oh my goodness. And like you're right too. Sometimes it is for the love. Sometimes it's like a hate thing, but still like passion, no matter what, for it. Because that to me is like the beauty of it. When you love, say, a show so much, you want to contribute to it in a way. And then like it's by fans for fans. So yeah, that's why I love fan fiction still, even though it's like, in terms of making that a profession, that's like you kind of have to do your own stuff, of course, your own original stuff. But it's certainly,
yes and no.
Yeah.
There's room for professional pastiche in the world. And Sherlock Holmes is actually one area where there's been quite a bit of that. People writing professionally what otherwise would be termed as fan fiction. Laurie King's Mary Russell books, for example, or even, the Oscar-winning film 7% Solution. These are fundamentally fan fiction about Sherlock Holmes, but they are professionally created and produced and published. Sometimes they're published with permission from the copyright owner. Sometimes they're published without permission from the copyright holder. And when that happens, they're relying on copyright doctrine of fair use to say they transform the underlying work in such a way that the commerciality is overridden by the transformativeness. But you're absolutely right. The vast majority of fan fiction, and for sure the important ethos of fan culture, is about sharing and gift giving and not about professionalizing.
Right. Because I've never personally like got into this, but I know like there's fan fiction where people just write about like real life too. Like, and then there's fandoms say, like, I know One Direction was like a big thing with that, which is cool though, again, like do what you love.
There is a lot of what we call real person fic out there.
Right.
And fans are big topics of that. There's just a lot of weird stuff out there in the world, and that's wonderful, right? I love that part of the joy of fan fiction is that you and 3 other people in the world might be fans of something, and you 4 get to share the thing you love, right?
It's so true. It is similar, honestly, with fan art as well, because people take characters that they love too, and like say if they put in their own art style, or like of course ships are a big thing. So like put any characters you want. It doesn't have to be based on the show itself. I'd rather canon, rather. It could just be anything. And people love it. It's wonderful because it all goes back to the passion, like we keep saying, and creativity as well. So it is a beautiful thing.
A lot of times also people use creating fan works as, everybody starts at a different time in their life, but a lot of people start making fan works early in their creative journey. And it's a way of building skills and building community and getting better. One of the things that a lot of people, we wrote a report for the US government a number of years now. I think it might have been 2008. It was a long time ago, but we did a lot of soliciting comments and input from fans about what they got out of fandom. And a lot of it had to do with community, but a lot of it also had to do with finding their voice as writers and building skills, building technological skills. If they were editing fan vids, that meant that they learned how to edit video. And so that sort of skill building aspect of it, when we're talking about writing, when you're writing something you care about, you also care about learning how to write well.
That's for me personally as well. Like I've seen my growth as a writer compared to like my early fan fiction writing days to present day. So yeah, you're absolutely right, because you could say like at its simplest form that it's a hobby, but then no, it's like if you're working on your craft, that's all that matters as well.
And that is, by the way, how all writers and artists work, right? They don't all necessarily start with fan works, but if you ask any classical painter how they got started, they would say by imitating other painters. Like that's just how people learn.
That's true, because even say like these popular things that we write about, like these shows and movies, they derive from things that influences in their own lives. Like if you say like Alfred Hitchcock, like what did he draw from? Like all these like classic things now that are built upon, that create like, like ongoing things like that in the horror genre and like all these other things. So it is fascinating. You're absolutely right. I want to go back to something you had mentioned. I'm curious to hear like your opinion on it, perhaps. That you mentioned that, which is, I have found to be the case, that the majority of fan fiction writers are female identifying. And so like I wonder why that is. Do you have any insight on that, perhaps?
Well, I don't know if I could say I have insight. I have ideas and thoughts.
Sure.
There's a whole, by the way, there's a whole massive field in academia of fan studies, and so a lot of very smart scholars have thought about this a lot more than I have, and I would not want to claim expertise as they do, but I think one of the reasons why women have found, and women and female identifying people who I will henceforth refer to as women, because they're women,
Right.
connect with fandom and fan communities, partly because of the community aspect of it, that it's a group of people they can connect with, but also a lot of them are writing stories where they don't see themselves in the underlying work. And they want to see themselves in the underlying work. Representation in mainstream media products is not great. It's getting better, but we can still appreciate things that we feel very critical of. And the representation of women in TV and film hasn't traditionally been as great as the representation of men in terms of thoroughness and depth and variety. And so writing things that resonate with you is something that I think a lot of women connect with. A lot of fan fiction, particularly a lot of fan fiction from the sort of early days of the internet fan communities, also was writing stories where male characters had real emotional and gentle sexual connection with each other or with other characters, and that was not necessarily canonical. Frequently, and in fact most frequently, it was not canonical. But again, I think it's something that women craved, which is the everything that you want from a love story without the baggage of gender expectations. And, romance stories about women are often very, very stereotyped. Romance stories about men are, take these people that we expect to have character depth and give them love as well, and give them emotional vulnerability, and give them these things that are all too often presumed to be female traits, like being helpless to your emotions. And of course, in real life, men are all of those things, or at least can be. And so having the ability to express that and share that in fiction is something that I think was missing from the mainstream media that these women loved. And if they wanted to watch, the show, they could do that. But if they wanted this other thing, they were going to have to do it themselves.
Yes.
And that's, I think, part of why this particular corner of fan creation grew up, or at least that's one part of a bigger picture. I will say, I make it sound sort of idyllic and wonderful. Fandom is not all idyllic and wonderful, and there have been reasonable and valid critiques of some of those same fan cultures in terms of their acceptance of men and their acceptance of fans of color of all genders. And I think fandom is getting better and is conscious of those things. But we shouldn't pretend that fandom is all welcoming and sparkly and amazing and perfect for everybody.
Absolutely. Again, this goes back to what you touched on as well, representation. People like on TV, but also behind the scenes, as in having more women showrunners and like even say like even in the 90s, for instance, like I know back then it wasn't as many women writers. Thankfully now it's not the case, like just with like even that, like for TV shows, things like that. So that's certainly important too.
No,
People of
a lot of
color.
my friends who are TV writers find themselves being only one or two women in the room.
Wow. Oh, wow.
Yeah. And by the way, it's worse for people of color, right?
Mhm.
There might be only one African American in the room.
Wow.
There might be no Asian writers in a room, right? So yeah, this is a problem that needs constant vigilance.
It really does. And it's like you think we've made all this progress, but then certainly no, it's still a long way to go. Definitely.
Yeah.
Wow. So in terms of going back to Archive of Our Own, because I
Mhm.
know with them, I believe that, correct me if I'm wrong, is that the biggest place for fan fiction? Because to my knowledge, I think there's currently like 5 million fanfics that live there, give or take. It's like, I believe it is the biggest. Is that right?
Well, maybe. It's hard
Hmm.
to say for sure. It is certainly massive, and it is, I think, fair to say the largest source of English speaking fan works on the internet. It also contains many, many fan works in non-English languages. I mean, it's a very international site with a very international user base. But I wouldn't want to say with certainty that there aren't fan sites with even more participants in other languages, mainly because I just don't know. There may be, there may not be, but I wouldn't want to say like, oh, we're the biggest and then be, an American centric jerk.
Oh, I hear you. I know that's, yeah, because obviously, yeah, being in the US, but yeah, because I know like even on fanfiction.net, for instance, the vast majority are English, but you could filter like by other languages as well, like for the
Yeah.
fanfics. But also again, going back to, because this is just like what's fascinating to me at this moment, talking about this, the gender identity of it all, because even say like, because I'm always focused mostly like in the TV field and like that industry specifically, that they always say it's harder to sell a show for like it's easier to get girls to watch a quote unquote boy centric show than it is to get boys to watch a quote unquote girl centric show. And again, I wonder why that is, because you look at, for instance,
Oh, I know
Powerpuff
what that
Girls,
is.
which, oh please, yes. Mhm.
Toxic masculinity and
Mhm.
patriarchy, right?
That's
Like,
all. Yeah.
of course it's patriarchy.
Mhm.
Like, women are, and girls are increasingly encouraged not only to be girly, but also to be this, right, if they're sort of embody traits that have traditionally been associated with male identities, like, self-sufficiency and athleticism, they're sort of, they can be praised for that.
Mhm.
Boys still are not as often praised for embodying traits that are more often associated with female identities, like, you know, compassion and
Mhm.
like, I mean, these are terrible things, right? These are awful stereotypes that are hurtful for everybody. And patriarchy is, turns out, just as bad for men as it is. That's not true, not just as bad, but it's bad for men too.
Mhm.
And one of the ways it's bad for men too is that men whose preferences and ideas of success don't fall squarely into this sort of patriarchal, toxic male thing have to defend themselves. And the route of least resistance is to just slide in with what a particular corner of society wants from you.
Yeah, because you're absolutely right. Just again, like in its simplest form, if like a little boy's crying compared to a little girl, to a little boy, they're gonna say, "Oh, man up!" Like just as simple as that, which is so horrible to like, like again, we're all human beings. We all have emotion, but you're right. It's so true that like they kind of learn at an early age, more or less, to like not tap into just even your own emotions. Yeah. And then it channels
This
into
is, I
anger and all
think,
this bad stuff. Yeah.
yeah, I think this is changing in the sense that I think we now live in a world where a lot of celebrities and particularly a lot of celebrities in younger generations, speaking very broadly, are much more comfortable with not conforming to those gender expectations and, you know, being fluid about their sexuality, being fluid about their wardrobe, being fluid about hairstyle and makeup, and expressing themselves about mental health and things that have not previously been associated with male identities, but are human things. And so, I mean, I think we're more and more seeing that young people have role models for that in ways that they didn't used to, but it's a process.
Definitely. And that goes back to that's why fan fiction can certainly help. Like you write out your feelings. Absolutely, definitely. So like for me to this day, I don't write fan fiction as much as I used to because then, like have because again, like you don't get paid for it, sadly, but like, just
Yeah.
again, like just for the love of it, but I don't do it as often. I do it here and there where like I'm just really inspired. I'm like, oh, because for me personally, it was always about kind of like, oh, I want the characters to do this finally. So I'm gonna write them doing it, whatever that may be. And more often than not, I would say, generally speaking, there is a lot of romantic fan fiction. There is a lot of kind of more, I don't want to like erotica, I would say, like, but
Oh yeah.
really well written. Like I've read some truly like beautifully written, poetic, like these gorgeous like love scene, like really beautiful. That's even better than like published works, I would say, which is
Oh yeah.
yeah.
And there's no shortage of what in the fan communities we would call gen, right? GEN, which is
Right.
just stories that are about the characters and in not romantic or sexual. You might say like, yeah, you know what, I really want to know what would happen if Harry Potter went to New York, so I'm going to write that, right? But you're also right that a lot of it is romantic or erotic or sexual in various ways, and that's partly a way for writers to express their own and explore their own sexualities, and partly, something that you're not going to get on TV, but that doesn't mean you're not interested in
Right.
it.
Well, that's true because then though that is with that as well, that is also part of like the stereotypes of fan fiction for people who like kind of look down on it, who haven't explored themselves. People tend to think, oh, it's badly written and it's porn. Like that's what people tend to think who aren't like involved it's too funny. And you know what? You can
There is lots of badly written fanfic and there's lots of porn. We
yeah.
we used to joke, I mean, we still do sometimes joke that because we do all this legal advocacy and we
Mm.
built this site for that is predicated on a concept of maximum inclusivity. We joke that we built this city on law and porn. uh,
I love that. Oh my God.
but like, the world needs porn. The world needs good porn. The world needs bad porn. And frankly, also, there's all kinds of studies showing that porn, commercially produced porn, is largely visual, right?
Hmm.
It's largely
True.
film. But in fact, women tend to find textual erotica more interesting than visual erotica. And this, these are broad generalizations,
Right.
but statistically, right, men want to watch porn and women want to read porn. And if the mainstream publishing houses aren't making it, then the women have to make it for themselves.
Yeah. Well, because that's the similar thing again, because romance novels are marketed towards women. It's always like kind of similar, say, even the cover. Like I could just picture one now, like a
Right.
chiseled man, Greek god, and then like, that's interesting. Huh. We're discussing, I find more interesting, like what my questions I had prepared. It's too funny. So I'm just like, I find all this fascinating. So in terms of what you do specifically in terms of protecting like with the legality of fan fiction, because I think there's also perhaps like a disparity that people that say look down on fan fiction that's saying like, oh, well, you're stealing people's work and like you're not creating your own stuff. But then so like I'm just curious to hear like your thoughts on like the actual protection of the actual fan work as opposed to like separate from the whatever it's from, the book, the movie, the show.
Yeah. So let's start with the legality of creating fanfic and fan works. And here I'm going to focus mostly on US law, although, there are similar laws in many countries. They all operate differently from each other. Some are much stricter, some are less stricter. The United States actually has a legal system that's designed to encourage, believe it or not, things like fan fiction. And that's, I think, not something that's part of mainstream discourse as much as perhaps it should be. And part of what the Organization for Transformative Works started with was we actually need people to understand that fanfic is a thing that the law doesn't just accept, but in many cases encourages. So there's a doctrine in US copyright law called fair use, which says it is not copyright infringement to make certain kinds of works. And then there's a complicated, multi-factor, somewhat unpredictable test that defines what kinds of works those are. But we start by saying, like, this isn't just a, like, it's infringement, but situation. It's not infringement, says the law. So what's incorporated in this test? Well, we begin by asking, does the work transform the underlying work by adding new meaning, message, or purpose? Frequently, fan works do very much transform the meaning, message, or purpose of the underlying work because they do something the underlying work wouldn't or couldn't do. Sometimes they don't, right? Sometimes they just want more of the thing in exactly the style of the thing. That's less transformative, but a lot of works of fan works are more transformative. And a lot of the things that we talk about, putting characters in situations that they wouldn't be in, is quite transformative. The next question that the test asks is the follow-on work commercial? Here, non-commercial works are more likely to be fair uses than commercial works. But since so much of fan fiction and fan culture is non-commercial, it's given away, it's shared, it satisfies that too. The next question we ask is what kind of work the underlying work is. That's going to vary widely from fan work to fan work. Right? Some are about fiction. A lot of them are about fiction, which makes it less likely to be fair use. But the ones that are about, advertising or real people or that kind of thing are about works that don't have much copyright to start with. The next thing we ask is how much of the underlying work is taken, and that's both how important is the content that was taken and how much quantity and quality. So fan works often take relatively limited parts of a work, right? They'll just take one setting, or they'll just take a bit of character without using much plot or without using much of the words of the underlying work. And then the last factor, which is often thought to be the most important factor, is the follow-on work competing in the market with the underlying work? And most fan works do not compete in the market with the underlying work at all, but they do something different from what the underlying work does. And there's an insatiable market that people are absolutely not going to read a fanfic instead of watching the show or going to the movies or any of that. They're going to do it in addition to doing those things. And in fact, to some extent, I think a large extent, in many cases, fanfic or other kinds of fan works enhances the market for the underlying work.
That's true.
People stay engaged.
Yes, definitely.
Something that otherwise they would lose interest in. So then what happens under the law is that all these factors get like thrown into a pot and stirred around, and you see, on balance, is this thing likely to be fair? And well, something that's transformative and non-commercial and doesn't use that much of the underlying work and doesn't compete with the underlying work in the market is exactly what the law is there to encourage. So that's how fair use works. Now, fair use is a case-by-case question. Every single work has to be examined differently. And there's a lot of factual differences between things, right? Some fan works are more transformative than others. Some are less transformative than others. Some might actually compete. Something that's really, really elaborate and has very high production values might actually, in theory, compete with what the copyright holder might make. But for the most part, fan works are not going to be problems under US law. And in fact, that's why we named ourselves the Organization for Transformative Works, is to highlight how transformative fan work is and to sort of connect it to that piece of the law. So fan fiction, by and large, is legal to make and do and share, and also in many cases legal to sell, although that changes the analysis and makes it it's like less likely to be fair if you're selling it, because one of the factors is it commercial? So selling it doesn't automatically make it not fair use, but it makes it less likely to be fair use. One of the sort of famous cases about fair use, though, is about a book called The Wind Done Gone, which is Gone with the Wind, retold from the point of view of the enslaved people on the plantation. That was a commercial book. It was sold in bookstores, and the court said, this is so transformative, and it definitely doesn't compete in the market with Gone with the Wind. People who aren't going to buy this instead of Gone with the Wind if they want Gone with the Wind, and vice versa. And it's an important work of criticism and commentary on this book that romanticized enslavement. So this thing should exist, and the court held that it was fair use and should be allowed to stay on the market. And it's fundamentally a fan work in a lot of ways, right? It's indistinguishable from fan fiction in all key ways, but it's right there. The court said, like, that's okay, go ahead and do it, even though it's commercial.
Oh, interesting. Because now as you're saying this, I've found this even actually in children's books, for example, where like it's been repurposed of like these classic fairy tales and things like that, repurposed, like say the big bad wolf's perspective of like Three Little Pigs, like other perspectives of these classic stories. So you're absolutely right. And even outside of fan fiction too, with people that parody things on YouTube and they do fan reaction videos and like song parodies, all these things. Yeah. Oh wow. It's
all that stuff. They're relying on fair use law to say we're making criticism and commentary or parody, and criticism, commentary, and parody are core down the line examples of what fair use exists to allow.
Right. Okay. Oh, that's really interesting though.
Yeah. So now let's go to the other part of your question, which may well be the question you meant to ask, which when people make fan works, do they have copyright in their fan works?
Right. Yes.
And the answer there also is yes, but their copyright is limited, and often significantly so. So the way copyright law works is that the creator of a derivative work, which is, sometimes you hear people use the word derivative as an insult. That's not how the law uses it. The law just means something derived from something else. But the creator of a work derived from another work owns copyright in what they themselves contributed, but doesn't own copyright in anything from that they used from the underlying work. So the writer of, say, Harry Potter fanfic owns their story, but doesn't own anything about Harry Potter. And this is also, by the way, how, like, Warner Brothers owns copyright in its Sherlock Holmes movie, even though up until January 1st, 2023, the Conan Doyle estate owned copyright in the last few stories of the Sherlock Holmes canon. By the way, hooray! The very last of the Sherlock Holmes stories went into the copyright public domain 14 days ago. So yeah, that's pretty exciting, right? Copyright finally expired on these stories that were written in the earlier part of the 20th century. So the part of the fanfic that is the fan creator's own contribution might be if they made original characters, or if they made a new plot, or if they made a new setting, and certainly their choice of specific words to use in telling the story, that would be copyrighted. They would be able, for example, then to, if someone came along, as happens, swipe something from fanfiction.net or Archive of Our Own and self-publishes it through Amazon and makes money, the fan author can say, wait a second, I wrote that. You didn't write that. You can't just sell my work.
Right.
And so fan authors own copyright in their particular fan works and can stop other people from selling their fan works. But their copyright is thin, and it's particularly thin as against the maker of the underlying work. So there's a pretty famous case from a US trial court called Anderson versus Stallone, where a guy wrote a treatment for a Rocky movie, and then the next Rocky movie that came out was a lot like his treatment.
Oh, huh.
And he said, wait a second, this is copyright infringement. I showed this to Stallone and he just stole it. And now, we can ask a lot about whether that's actually true, but what the court said in that case was, well, wait a second, this whole treatment was infringing, as it was a non-transformative treatment of a new Rocky film that was completely saturated with aspects of the previous Rocky films. And therefore, the writer of the treatment, Anderson, didn't actually really own copyright in anything, and particularly didn't own copyright as against Stallone. So that case is a bit of an outlier. You wouldn't want to say that case is the law everywhere, because it's not. It's from one trial court in one district, but it demonstrates the fragility of fans' copyrights as against the maker, right? So if you write, let's go back to Harry Potter fanfic, and then Warner Brothers decides to make your fanfic the plot of its next Fantastic Beasts movie, you're probably not going to win that lawsuit, even if you might morally be correct. And the reason is because Warner Brothers owns copyright in the Fantastic Beasts franchise. And they're going to say anything you wrote is basically just an unauthorized derivative work, and it's not sufficiently transformative to be fair use, and therefore we can use it.
So that's interesting, though. Yes, that makes sense, because it's basically like your plot or whatever it may be, original character set. Yeah, that makes sense.
So in other words, you could probably stop someone from republishing your fanfic, but you probably couldn't stop Warner Brothers from remaking your fanfic.
I see, right, of course. Yeah. Well, in a way, that'd be amazing. They'll be like, oh, look, I did, like, but no one believe you. I'm sure I'd be like, oh, that was my idea. Like, that'd be something. That'd be really something to brag about, but so people will be like, okay, yeah, sure. Like,
There have been
so,
lawsuits like that where,
hmm,
people have written books and then movies have been made that are really
hmm,
similar to the books. There was one such lawsuit about Coming to America. There was another that was about the movie Amistad, but there's been a bunch of them. And, the pride of saying I wrote that is great, but if you ask the people who brought these lawsuits, what they would say is even greater is getting a cut of the profits from these very famous movies.
yeah, there you go. Oh my God. Well, that's too fun. Yeah, absolutely. But well, because I know, for instance, like say with me, like when I write, say like original pilots, they always say to like register it through like the WGA and everything, the
Yes.
Copyright Office, because an idea cannot be protected, so to speak. But like if you have an actual script, then that's like that, of course, could be protected and held up in court and everything. Yeah, in the court of
That's
law.
absolutely right. And,
Mhm.
I can't give legal advice to non-clients. So what I'm about to say is not legal advice. It is merely
Mhm.
information. But absolutely, ideas are not copyrightable.
Mhm.
And so this is how we can end up with, like, you can't own the idea of a tech savvy spy who likes to do voiceovers. If you could, MacGyver would own that idea and Burn Notice couldn't have existed. But MacGyver and Burn Notice are actually pretty different from each other. And so, absolutely, right, if somebody wrote a script that was substantially similar to something that gets made, that's pretty different from having an idea that's similar to something that gets made. And so you want to register that script with the Copyright Office because
Mhm.
you need to register with the Copyright Office before you can sue. Right? You have copyright regardless, but if you want to sue, it has to be registered with the Copyright Office. You also probably want to register it with the WGA for different reasons,
Mhm.
because if you end up in arbitration with any other writers, you want your script to be on record at the time it was done. So, right, so there are different reasons. One is if you want to sue, and the other is for purposes of WGA arbitration, but you really do want to do both.
Absolutely. And all these things to protect yourself. I know also Library of Congress, as I mentioned. And even I believe another thing you could do, they say you could mail yourself your script and then like not have it open. Like, yeah, as long as you have the date on there. I believe that's oh no. Okay, never mind.
Well, let me
No, please.
disabuse any of your listeners of this
No,
notion.
please. Yeah.
So Library of Congress and Copyright Office are the same thing. So
Okay.
registering it with the Copyright Office is the same thing as registering it with the Library of Congress.
Okay. Hmm.
The thing that is often referred to as poor man's copyright, which is
Hmm.
mailing it to yourself, um,
Okay.
it doesn't work for
Okay.
really good reasons. The theory behind it would be you could prove that you wrote it based on the postmark on the mailing. If we think about this in a practical sense, though, when are you going to open that envelope? You're going to open that envelope in open court?
Right.
If not, if you're going to open it any earlier, then the existence of that envelope doesn't help you in terms of proving that what's inside the envelope is happened on a particular date. Right? So telling somebody, "Oh, I have this poor man's copyright, trust
Mhm.
me," is probably not going to be compelling to them. The other reason is that you do actually need to register your copyright with the Copyright Office before you can sue. So poor man's copyright might allow you to send a threatening letter to somebody, but it wouldn't allow you to bring a lawsuit.
Okay. Hmm.
In other words, if you really want to if you really want to defend the date you wrote something, mailing it isn't going to help you. Registering with the Copyright Office will.
Right. So it's worth spending the money. I believe also, I think it's like 10 years. I think it's something like that. And then you could have to like re-register it. But yeah, it's worth it then.
And registering it's not free. It's not
Yeah.
immensely expensive. And so right, you have to think about like what you want to copyright. This is an issue for makers of memes and gift sets
Oh,
because registering can take a matter of months. And if you like, the value of your meme is in a matter of months is going to be gone. And so there are problems with the registration system, but for things like scripts, it's fine.
gotcha. Hmm. So again, going back to fan culture. So I know, of course, you've spoken at LA Comic Con, you've spoken at San Diego Comic Con. I love to hear kind of your experience with just like being at fan conventions, like your kind of favorite takeaways just from doing those panels and everything.
I love
Mm.
fan conventions. I don't love the crush of humanity, but I love that the crush of humanity exists. One of the things I love about fan conventions is there are so many different ways to be a fan.
Yeah.
And that has not always been expressed at fan conventions historically. You know, when I first started going to cons, I often felt kind of like an outsider, but I'm not an outsider anymore.
Mhm.
Cons are full of everybody, and it's amazing and it's wonderful. Cons are full of every size and shape and color and gender identity and nationality, and it's just glorious. LA
Mm.
Comic Con is actually, in some ways, better than San Diego in one particular sense, which is that San Diego Comic Con, you can't really be a vendor unless you've been a vendor forever, which means
Mhm.
there isn't quite as much diversity among the vendor tables as there is at LA Comic Con. One of my favorite things to do at cons is just walk the hall and see
Mm.
what people have made that I don't know. Like the indie press area of a con is like you will discover so many books that you never see just running into them. And that's really cool. You'll find artists in Artist Alley that you've never heard of who are doing really cool, interesting work. At San Diego Comic Con, one of the advantages is there are these panels that are occupied by incredibly talented people who you can't just run into in the world, but you can listen to what they have to say and you can actually ask them questions. And so I try to spend, you know, the better part of a day just going to panels presented by interesting people. I also, you know, there are a couple of panels for shows that I'll want to go to because I just like, I just want to see those people because I like them.
I know. And I had so much fun. I was like, oh my goodness, it's so much fun. Just also seeing all the cosplay, people dressing up, they go all out. I think it's a beautiful thing, honestly, too, because people just go up to people, be like, oh, I love your costume. Can I take a picture with you? Like, it's just pure like joy and love. Again, I love that. Beautiful.
I absolutely love the cosplay and the
Yeah.
creativity of
Yeah.
the cosplay is so massive. And this is even more true at San Diego, and really true at Dragon Con in Georgia.
Hmm.
Just amazing, like mashup cosplay where
Hmm.
people will combine two different sets of source material
Wow.
and make a costume that mashes those up. Or there's a lot of gender crossplay or race crossplay where people are
Wow.
playing with like the one of my favorite cosplays ever was gender swapped, or not sorry, gender swapped, so both female cosplayers, but also race swapped Lando Calrissian and Han Solo.
Oh, wow. Hmm.
And so it was these two women in race swapped costumes.
Hmm.
And it was awesome to look at and also kind of thought provoking. Another one of my favorites was Native American Captain America.
Oh, wow.
Made his own, he was Native American, had used his own tribe's manufacturing techniques to make a traditionally styled Native American Captain America costume. So his shield was deer hide.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh
And it
my
was like,
gosh.
it was so cool. It was like, yeah, of course, this is thought provoking and artistically incredible. And this is where you get to see that kind of thing is at cons.
I love that. Wow, that's amazing. And this is kind of like a, I don't know, this is like a broad question I had, but I am interested in just hearing your thoughts. Where do you see, maybe it's like two separate things. Like, where do you see fan culture heading and like fan fiction culture? Do you see just kind of more of the same, people just producing great stuff, or like just your thoughts on that?
I think I see the technological architectures have had a lot of impact on fan works and fan communities. And we don't know what the next technological architectures are going to be. I do think that the ability to sort of mini commercialize has changed fan culture enormously, because now people can have Patreons.
Right.
And they didn't used to. And it's changed some of the expectations around non-commerciality and gift giving. There's still a very, I think, thorough ethos of gift economy, but there's also a lot of people who are, in tough financial times, as we are in now, we're like, yeah, I actually would like the people who like my fan works to like help me pay my rent. And
True.
that's happening more and more. I don't think it's bad, but I do think it changes some of the cultural assumptions and expectations around what being a fan is. The other thing we've seen a lot of in the past decade or two are entertainment companies realizing just how valuable fans are to their bottom line.
Yeah.
And exploiting fans and fan work and fan labor for their own benefit. That creates a couple of problems. I think that is not great. It is, it can be good for the franchises, because the franchises can then incorporate things that fans care about, but it pulls fans into the world of the entertainment companies' expectations and a little bit out of the world of doing things that the entertainment companies didn't want and wouldn't do in the first place. It also means that the powers that be are a little bit more aware of what fans are doing, which I don't think is great for fans.
Mm-hmm.
I think fans do best when they're kind of on their own, being in their own communities,
Yeah.
and not being policed by the powers that be. And so that, I think that has changed quite a bit, that movie studios, etc., have started marketing kind of fan experiences in a way that they never had before. And, there's lots of ways to be a fan, but those for me don't feel like they're great for fan culture in terms of, these little online fic sharing groups.
I know. Oh goodness. That is unfortunate to hear. But again, it's still, there's always gonna be people writing fan fiction. People are always gonna be drawing their own stuff, which is great too. I love like the fan artwork too that people do.
Oh
Like,
yeah, and
cool.
fan games, like fan video
Oh,
games.
true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fan music. There's a whole
Yeah.
tradition known as filking, where people put their own lyrics,
Oh,
to existing songs, and fan vids, which are unbelievably amazing, where people
yeah.
make sort of music videos that collect clips from a TV show or multiple TV shows and tell a story to a song. Just incredibly artistic and thought-provoking and fun. So all of those things are going to keep going. People are going to keep doing those because they can't help it.
Yeah.
And that makes me happy.
Absolutely, me too. Oh my goodness. This has been such a absolutely wonderful and insightful conversation, Betsy. I've learned a lot. Thank you so much for being here. So as we're wrapping up, the last thing I want to ask you, just any advice, can be life advice, advice for writers, advice for people wanting to get into law, any advice that you care to share?
Yeah, my advice is, if you want to do it, do it. If there's something out there that doesn't exist that you want to exist, make it. You will find somebody who wants to see it. It may not be that thing that you make that people want to see. It may be the thing 3 or 4 things from now, and that can be hard, but that's how you get good. Right? Every writer starts with 5 bad things before they get to a good thing.
Yeah.
And fan works are a great way to do that.
Yes, agreed. Even me with this podcast, this is a passion project of mine. I've been doing this since September 2018. So God, it's going to be 5 years this year, which is crazy. And I just do this for the love of it. I'm interviewing wonderful people like you. So thank you so much again, Betsy.
Yeah.
Please let everyone know where they can find you on social media and if there's anything else you want to promote.
Well, so you can find me on, I'm not actually a big social user except for Twitter, which I have used less and less in recent months for what may be obvious reasons.
Yeah.
But my Twitter is at 221 Betsy. So like 221B Baker Street, but 221 Betsy.
Gotcha.
And that's my Twitter. Otherwise, you can find my bio at the University of Tulsa website. So if you go to University of Tulsa and you search for Betsy Rosenblatt, you'll find me. You can find the Organization for Transformative Works at transformativeworks.org. You can find the Archive of Our Own at ao3.org or archiveofourown.org. It's a nonprofit, so we appreciate everybody's support who gives it, but we also appreciate everybody who just comes in and is part of the community for any reason at all. And that's, I think, all the stuff you would want or need to know about how to find me.
Perfect. And so just, yeah, keep creating, everyone out there listening, you know. Oh,
Exactly.
wonderful. And with that, that's going to conclude this week's episode of Storytelling Saga. Be sure to visit storytellingsaga.com for all places to listen and where to follow on social media. And as always, feel free to send me any questions, comments, or writing prompts by emailing me at storytellingsaga@gmail.com. Next episode, I'm so excited to discuss Avatar: The Last Airbender with special guest Harry Mackin. Until then, thank you for listening, and remember, write what you love.